Every day, Catholic Charities agencies across the United States anticipate and respond to the elevated risks and challenges of assisting their local communities when they're impacted by disasters. This training provides a snapshot of what to expect when your agency has to transition to disaster response. Your agency does case management year-long. This training is designed to help you best adapt your skills to operate in a disaster. The content is based on the actual experiences of your Catholic Charities colleagues. Additional in-depth training on disaster case management is available from Catholic Charities USA, or CCUSA. This training includes an electronic participant guide you can access at the same site as this video. The participant guide has a content outline for note-taking and a resource section that includes all of the checklists and other job aids that will be introduced in the training. If a disaster event has just occurred, these checklists and job aids can be tailored to include your agency and community disaster-specific details. This video has 3 parts. Part 1 describes what agencies can expect if their community experiences a disaster event. Part 2 defines the disaster case management function and focuses on how case managers prepare to transition to that role. Part 3 examines how agency leadership prepares for and enables disaster case managers to perform their critical functions. Local Catholic Charities agencies across the country respond to a variety of hazards. Most are natural events, like hurricanes, wildfires, floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, and other severe storms. These seem to occur relentlessly year after year, and have produced many lessons learned and best practices for organizations to follow. While at the national level, CCUSA remains focused solely on natural disasters, your agency may experience human-caused events such as chemical and oil spills, industrial accidents, violence and rioting, local explosions, and domestic terrorism. These can also have terrible economic effects on populations, resulting in the need for disaster case management. Every community is at risk from some kind of hazard. Therefore, planning for your agency's disaster response role includes envisioning what could happen in your community when disaster events occur. This could include damaged and destroyed homes, physical injuries and loss of life, interrupted water, electricity, gas, and other utility services, disruptions to transportation, mail service, schools, internet and phone service, loss of jobs, and separated families. Mental health impacts of disasters are also important considerations when planning to assist your community. Disaster survivors in general, and particularly those already in poverty or other vulnerable circumstances, may feel unable to cope, unwilling or unable to leave damaged homes, and confused about either the abundance of or lack of information about their circumstances and available assistance. Under challenging circumstances, Catholic Charities agencies create operational disaster strategies that embrace their community and bring to life the words of Pope Francis. Be a beacon of hope for all, working in the streets and meeting the people where they are. During a disaster, agencies can anticipate an increased need for Catholic Charities assistance. Clients already receiving services may have additional disaster-related needs. People who have never asked for assistance of any kind are often forced to seek help in disasters. Disaster survivors who are fearful of government involvement or intervention into their lives will be likely to turn to faith-based organizations like Catholic Charities. There are many ways agencies engage and participate in the disaster recovery process. One of the most valuable services an agency can provide is to expand case management capabilities to help disaster survivors access resources for their disaster-related unmet needs. Disaster case managers are case managers operating in an expanded capacity that includes helping clients to identify disaster recovery priorities and develop plans to accomplish their goals, serving as the client's point of contact to receive valuable information, provide referrals, and access disaster recovery resources, advocating with third parties on behalf of the client for services and resources, and monitoring the client's recovery progress by maintaining contact until the case can be closed. Your participant guide includes specific checklists for meeting disaster case management responsibilities. In this video, we'll cover some of the most important points. Every disaster can be seen as a catastrophe in the community in which it occurs. Depending on the event, there may initially be considerable disruption in routine agency communications. Disaster case managers need to know where and when to report for work, if the agency has established new lines of communication and a plan for contacting existing clients, and how services are being communicated to the local community. Disaster case managers are considered frontline staff and will often be the face of Catholic Charities to a disaster survivor. It is important, then, to be prepared for the type of cases to expect. Reliable data on the demographics of the disaster-affected areas will also be valuable when anticipating the types of assistance that will be needed. For instance, identifying communities with an older or younger population that may require special assistance. Determining the housing situation, such as the percentage of homeowners versus renters. Anticipating language or cultural diversity, and the need for translated forms and language interpreters. Exploring the area's available modes of travel to determine whether they are accessible to disaster survivors. Disaster case managers will also need to know if it will be necessary to visit clients off-site. It is essential that disaster case managers are familiar with the programs and resources available to assist disaster survivors. The size, scope, severity, and type of the event will influence the availability of disaster assistance programs. If the impacts are local only, the government may not provide any additional resources. In this case, the disaster case manager's challenge is to help meet extraordinary needs with ordinary resources. Local partners and other voluntary, non-governmental organizations can bring invaluable resources to the disaster response and recovery process. It is important for disaster case managers to know what agencies are responding to the disaster event, what assistance you or they will provide, and how voluntary non-governmental organizations will coordinate. Coordinating with other agencies and organizations may avoid duplicating services, making the best use of limited resources available. In larger disaster events, agencies may operate jointly and use data collection systems and analysis for case management tracking. When voluntary agencies are all represented in one location, it's called a Multi-Agency Resource Center, or MARC. If a disaster event exceeds the capabilities of the local and state governments, the United States President can invoke the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief Act and approve a major disaster federal declaration. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is charged with the coordination of federal agency disaster assistance. Federal assistance may include disaster unemployment benefits, disaster supplemental nutrition assistance program, disaster housing assistance, and individual assistance resources. When assisting disaster survivors, remember that undocumented persons may not be eligible for federal assistance. In addition, many families with both documented and undocumented members may not want to engage with the government agencies at all. The participant guide includes additional samples of the array of federal assistance programs for which disaster survivors may qualify. It contains information on how and when these programs become available, such as after a presidential declaration, and how clients can learn which programs are available for the current disaster. The disaster case management process can assist disaster survivors with eligibility information and access to these resources. Organizations providing assistance will have their own eligibility criteria and procedures to follow. It is important for disaster case managers to be familiar with any eligibility requirements, as well as understanding how to avoid duplication of benefits, what are required processes and procedures, who are the experts in these organizations. Disaster case managers may be able to save disaster clients from multiple calls and return visits if they can inform them immediately about what is required to establish eligibility for assistance. For example, FEMA registration requires Social Security, insurance, and financial information, in addition to basic contact information. States may also request funding for a state-level disaster case management program from FEMA, which, if implemented, may involve coordination with Catholic Charities. There may be new disaster-related procedures in place for protecting client privacy, such as release forms to authorize sharing information with other assistance agencies and organizations, guidelines for assisting undocumented disaster survivors, parameters for sharing or reporting disaggregated data with state and federal partners. Disaggregated data can be collected from multiple sources. It is often used to reveal underlying trends, patterns, or insights. And obtaining proper permissions for media-related photos and interviews with disaster survivors. Within Catholic Charities, disaster case managers typically consult with their disaster case management supervisor on special intake, referral, and other service procedures or requirements. If disaster case managers are expected to meet clients outside the agency, they will need to know the agency policy for providing services in a mobile location and for home visits. Rules might include traveling in pairs, alerting a specific point of contact to their whereabouts as a check-in process, or maintaining a strict schedule and obeying local curfews. Checklists used by case managers transitioning to disaster case managers are included in the electronic participant guide. Samples of case file checklists, client intake forms, and consent to release confidential information forms may be found in the participant guide as well. Once the disaster case manager has the necessary program information, procedures, and tools, disaster client interviews can be scheduled and the work of recovery can begin. Disaster case managers collect the data needed and work with each client to develop their recovery plan. This collaboration with the client is very important. It helps the client regain control in their lives and become active participants in their recovery. Effective disaster case managers encourage survivors to tell their stories, to detail how they are affected by the disaster. By listening to these details, disaster case managers can identify the emotional and spiritual as well as the physical needs of their clients. Disaster case managers may play an important role in helping disaster survivors deal with the trauma of their experiences. Encouraging survivors to tell their stories, listening with empathy and respect, allows case managers to identify and help address the emotional and spiritual needs of their clients. Intake forms provide an organized approach to information gathering. They prompt the disaster case managers to look at multiple factors that will result in the best recovery plan for the client, such as pre-event circumstances, disaster impacts, and other vulnerability factors. Immediate needs for food, water, shelter, and/or safety are identified in addition to extensive documentation. One of the most important elements on the checklist is obtaining client contact information that includes, if possible, more than one method of contact. For example, ask for an email address, a landline number, and a cell phone number. Gather secondary contact or emergency contact information as well. By completing an intake form and gathering information required by available government, non-government, and volunteer programs, disaster case managers can identify the programs that align with their clients' needs and eligibility. Not every recovery plan looks the same, but most contain recovery goals including immediate needs and other prioritized needs, action steps and resources for accomplishing the goals of the recovery plan, a timeline for completing each goal, the responsible party for accomplishing each goal, and notes on a schedule for follow-up and reevaluation. Disaster case managers ensure that disaster-affected clients know how to access disaster case management services and resources to assist in their recovery. Disaster case management follow-up includes ongoing assessment, evaluation, and changes as needed to facilitate the successful completion of a disaster client's recovery plan. During this process, the disaster case manager may collect additional data and present the client's case to the Long-Term Recovery Committee to advocate for resources on behalf of the client. While a disaster may seem overwhelming because of the context, and programs are different than what you are dealing with every day, the skill set of a case manager is the same regardless of the scenario. Listening with compassion and approaching the future in collaboration with the client is a gift to offer, be it any day or after a disaster. You will make a wonderful difference in the life of your client. The brief walkthrough of how disaster case managers prepare for and carry out their responsibilities is sure to instill questions about how the agency's management team provides the information and resources needed to support disaster case management programming. This training focuses on what agency management should accomplish to facilitate and transition agency programming for disaster case management service provision. The participant guide also includes specific checklists for meeting agency management responsibilities. Some of the most important points are covered in this video. There are 5 broad objectives to meet when transitioning an agency to disaster case management programming. 1. Develop a plan and protocols for transitioning agency programming to disaster response. 2. Train staff, which includes volunteers, for this transition. 3. Provide necessary information, forms, tools, job aids, and equipment to disaster case managers and supervisors. 4. Identify and respond to ongoing needs of staff to successfully perform disaster case management. And 5. Identify and capture disaster case management best practices and lessons learned. Tasks related to these objectives have been organized into checklists that are included in the participant guide. Reliable information about disaster impacts, the demographics of the affected population, and the level of government response is crucial for planning disaster case management programming. Depending on identified needs, the agency can triage their response efforts. In other words, limited resources can be used to meet specific critical needs such as food, water, shelter, and safety. In the confusion of the post-disaster environment, a clear message about the agency's role in providing recovery assistance is critical and will inform both the agency staff and disaster survivors looking for help. A sample statement is included in the participant guide. Additional information on the disaster environment and capacity can be found by accessing the Concept of Operations and Capacity Framework guides found on the CCUSA members page under Disaster Operations. If normal communications capabilities are disrupted, management will need to establish or simply activate plans for emergency communication. Agencies should have defined procedures as part of an agency emergency or continuity of operations plan for communicating with the local bishop, the Catholic Charities Board of Directors, necessary diocesan staff, and internally with staff, including any new reporting requirements. Likewise, the agency communications procedure should also include plans for messaging the general public on services offered, both for disaster survivors and for local donors wanting to support the work of Catholic Charities, various governmental and non-governmental service providers, existing clients, and local diocesan press and community media. The best time to develop relationships and establish disaster protocols with other community providers is during non-disaster times. After an event, disaster case managers will need information about assistance options available to clients. This requires the agency to reach out and identify the services available from FEMA, other federal agencies, state agencies, volunteer organizations active in disasters, or VOADs, local foundations, and community partners. Establish points of contact and protocols for contacting private groups and government agencies, and determine the location of or extent of the agency's participation in the Multi-Agency Resource Center, if one has been established for the disaster. Catholic Charities USA has intake forms for both the short-term disaster casework process and the long-term disaster case management program. If the agency is transitioning into a state-level disaster case management program with government funding, obtain and provide disaster case managers and supervisors with the forms, procedures, and training required by the managing state entity. A recommended case file packet can be found by accessing the CCUSA members page under Disaster Operations. Agency responsibilities may change with new disaster-related programs or priorities. Adjust staffing roles and add staff as needed to meet new disaster roles and realities and to continue providing disaster case management services. This may require the agency to obtain new hires, particularly if current case management staff are associated with a particular funded program. Ideal candidates understand FEMA resources, state resources, and/or volunteer resources, and have proven case management experience. Establish clear lines of authority with staff and volunteers, working through appointed supervisors. And clarify expectations and establish reporting procedures. Provide comprehensive transition training for both staff and volunteers. Recommended training includes Catholic Charities Disaster Case Management Training, available through Catholic Charities USA. Disasters are often recurring events. Areas prone to hurricanes, floods, or wildfires, for example, often experience them more than once. It is important that agency leadership plan for and implement a process for keeping a record of the best practices and lessons learned about disaster case management. Specific items to track are listed in the participant guide. Working in a disaster environment can be chaotic, stressful, physically and emotionally taxing, and demanding. There may be physical dangers, such as broken sidewalks or damaged roadways. There may be societal dangers, such as an angry or stressed population due to limited resources or slow government response. Catholic Charities agencies may be challenged if disaster case management staff are also disaster survivors. Simply trying to meet the need of so many people who have been affected by a disaster can greatly increase the levels of physical and emotional stress on agency staff. The agency can plan for some important aspects of staff care. Communicate regularly while staff members travel outside the agency. Have periodic conversations about workload, stress level, concerns, and successes. Monitor their day-to-day activities, schedules, and downtime to ensure staff are transitioning to their roles in disaster case management. Create teams to ensure no staff member travels alone, providing support and an added level of safety. Disaster-related employee assistance may include establishing mental health or emotional care stations at the agency, providing counselors for guidance and advice, providing flexible work schedules to allow for transportation or other infrastructure challenges and to accommodate staff who are also affected by the disaster event. Depending on the disaster and the needs of the community, disaster case management staff may be required to work longer hours and on days they are not normally scheduled. To the extent possible, schedule specific hours off during the day or days off during the week, overlapping schedules if needed to fill gaps. Identify staff that have been affected by the disaster and create schedules that accommodate their needs. This training outlined information that will be useful to current and qualified case managers and agency leadership as they transition to disaster case management responsibilities. The resource section of the participant guide includes the checklists, sample forms, reports, and sample client recovery plan discussed during the training. They are available as individual documents for use in emergencies or disaster events. This has been only a brief introduction to the circumstances and requirements for transitioning from case management and casework related to everyday emergency service programming to disaster case management programming. Talk to peers at agencies that have more disaster experience and to CCUSA if you have questions or need help. Pre-disaster planning will enable you to be the beacon of hope that your staff and community require when disasters happen. Remember, it's never a matter of when the disaster occurs. It's more a matter of how we respond when they happen. Begin planning for disasters now. Contact Catholic Charities for technical assistance, consulting, or to be connected to the Disaster Operations Network.